More than 5 decades ago, a helicopter flew across the television screen and America heard a song that sounded almost too sad for a comedy. Then came the tents, the operating room, the wounded soldiers, the jokes told too quickly because silence would have hurt too much. And in the middle of it all was the 4077th, a small army hospital filled with doctors, nurses, and soldiers trying to stay human in a place built by war. MASH was never just another TV show. It made America laugh, but it also made America feel the cost of every laugh. Hawkeye joked because the pain was too close. Margaret fought to be respected. Radar carried innocence through a world that kept trying to take it away. Klinger turned survival into comedy. Father Mulcahy tried to keep faith alive when everything around him was breaking. But now, more than 54 years after MASH first entered American homes, the question feels different. Who is still alive? Who has passed away? And what really happened to the cast after the final goodbye? Some of them are still with us, but many of the faces America loved from the 4077th are gone. And that is why looking back at MASH in 2026 does not feel like watching an old sitcom. It feels like opening a memory. To understand why MASH still matters in America, you have to understand what made it different. On the surface, it looked like a comedy. There were jokes, pranks, arguments, ridiculous schemes, and characters who could make a hospital tent feel like a stage. But underneath the laughter was something much heavier. MASH was about war. Not the glory of war, not the speeches, the medals, or the battlefield heroics. It was about what happened after the fighting. When the wounded arrived, when doctors had to work too fast, when young men were carried into surgery, and when humor became the only way to survive another day. That is why the show reached so many people. It arrived during a time when America was still wrestling with the pain and division of Vietnam, even though the story itself was set during the Korean War. Viewers saw the past, but they felt the present. And inside the 4077th, they found something unforgettable. A group of people who were scared, exhausted, flawed, funny, angry, compassionate, and deeply human. That is what made MASH last. It was not just a show about doctors in a war zone. It was a show about people trying not to lose themselves. And no one carried that complicated mix of comedy, anger, tenderness, and pain more powerfully than Alda as Hawkeye Pierce. At the center of MASH was Hawkeye Pierce, the doctor who could make people laugh in the middle of the worst place on earth. Played by Alda, Hawkeye was brilliant, sarcastic, rebellious, and impossible to ignore. He hated the war, hated authority, and hated the idea that young men were being torn apart while the rest of the world pretended it made sense. But instead of turning cold, he turned sharp. His humor became armor. His jokes became a way to keep pain from swallowing him whole. That was what made Hawkeye different. He was funny, but never empty. Behind every wisecrack was exhaustion. Behind every prank was anger. Behind every smile was a man who had seen too much blood, too much fear, and too many lives changed forever on an operating table. Alda gave the character that depth. He did not play Hawkeye as just the clever doctor with the best lines. He played him as a man fighting to stay human in a place designed to break people down. And audiences felt that. For 11 seasons, Hawkeye became the emotional voice of the 4077th. He was the one who could challenge hypocrisy, comfort the wounded, mock the powerful, and still fall apart when the weight became too much. Through him, MASH found its strongest balance between comedy and tragedy. After the series, Alda continued to build a remarkable career as an actor, writer, director, and communicator. But no matter how much he did afterward, Hawkeye Pierce remained the role that tied him forever to millions of American viewers. In 2026, Alda stands as one of the most important surviving links to MASH. And that makes his presence even more powerful. Because when fans ask who is still alive after all these years, Hawkeye is not just a name on a list. He is the voice that still echoes from the 4077th. Funny, wounded, angry, compassionate, and unforgettable.
But Alda was not the only face America never forgot.
Beside him was a woman who began as one of television's most misunderstood characters, then slowly became one of its strongest. Beside Hawkeye Pierce stood one of the most unforgettable women in classic television, Major Margaret Houlihan. When MASH began, Margaret was often seen through a narrow lens. She was strict, military, demanding, and difficult. To many viewers, she was Hot Lips, the head nurse who seemed more loyal to rules and rank than to the messy humanity around her. But over the years, something remarkable happened. Margaret changed. Or maybe the audience finally learned how to see her. Loretta Swit took a character who could have remained a stereotype and slowly gave her dignity, loneliness, pride, vulnerability, and strength. Margaret was not just the woman who argued with Hawkeye. She was a nurse trying to hold herself together in a war zone. She wanted respect in a place where men often treated her like a punchline. She wanted love, but she also wanted control. She wanted to be strong, even when the war kept proving how fragile everyone really was. That evolution made her one of the emotional surprises of MASH. And Loretta Swit understood the character deeply. She allowed Margaret to soften without making her weak. She allowed her to become more human without losing her fire. By the later seasons, Margaret Houlihan was no longer just a comic foil. She was one of the show's strongest symbols of survival. After MASH, Swit continued to work on stage and screen, and she became known for her devotion to animal welfare and advocacy. But for millions of fans, she would always be Margaret. Proud, complicated, wounded, and unforgettable. Her passing in 2025 made the question of who is still alive feel even more painful. Because for so long, Loretta Swit was one of the last great living faces of the 4077th. And now, when fans look back at Margaret Houlihan, they are not just remembering a character. They are remembering a woman who grew up in front of America. And while Margaret became stronger with every season, another beloved member of the 4077th carried something different. The innocence that war could never fully destroy. After Margaret Houlihan showed the strength it took to survive the 4077th, MASH gave audiences a very different kind of heart through Radar O'Reilly. Played by Gary Burghoff, Radar was the young clerk who seemed to know what was coming before anyone else did. He could hear helicopters before they arrived. He could finish Colonel Blake's sentences. He could move through the chaos of the camp with a kind of nervous innocence that made him feel almost untouched by the war around him. But that was exactly why audiences loved him. Radar reminded viewers of the boys who were sent into war before they were ready to become men. He was funny, gentle, awkward, loyal, and deeply vulnerable. In a place filled with blood, exhaustion, and dark humor, Radar carried something fragile. He carried innocence. Gary Burghoff made the character unforgettable because he never played Radar as just a joke. Beneath the wide eyes and nervous voice was a young man trying to understand a world that kept asking too much from him. When Radar left MASH, it felt like the 4077th lost a piece of its soul. And decades later, fans still remember him not because he was the loudest character, but because he was one of the purest. But MASH was never only about innocence. It also had characters who turned survival into comedy, and no one did that quite like Maxwell Klinger. If Radar represented the innocence of MASH, then Maxwell Klinger represented something very different, the desperate, ridiculous, unforgettable comedy of survival. Played by Jamie Farr, Klinger first entered the 4077th as a joke that audiences could not ignore. He wore dresses, hats, robes, and outrageous outfits, all in the hope that the army would finally decide he was unfit for service and send him home. On the surface, it was absurd, but underneath the comedy was something very real. Klinger was not trying to be famous. He was not trying to entertain anyone. He was trying to escape a war he never wanted to be part of. And that made the joke sharper than it first appeared. Every outrageous outfit was also a silent confession. He wanted out. Jamie Farr turned what could have been a one-note character into one of the most beloved faces on the show. Klinger became funny, loyal, clever, and strangely heroic in his own way. He stopped being just the man in the dresses and became part of the family. And that is why fans still remember him with such affection. Because in the madness of the 4077th, Klinger proved that laughter was not always weakness. Sometimes it was the only thing keeping people alive. And then came B.J. Hunnicutt, the family man whose quiet decency gave the later years of MASH a different kind of heart. When Mike Farrell joined MASH as B.J. Hunnicutt, he was stepping into a space that could not have been easy to fill. Trapper John was gone. The old rhythm of the 4077th had changed, and the show needed someone who could stand beside Hawkeye without simply becoming a replacement. BJ became something different. He was quieter than Hawkeye, less reckless, less desperate to turn every wound into a joke. But beneath that calm was a deep sadness of his own. BJ was a husband and a father pulled away from the life he loved. Every day at the 4077th reminded him that somewhere far away, his family was growing older without him. That was what Mike Farrell brought to the role. He gave BJ decency, warmth, patience, and a kind of emotional restraint that made the character feel painfully real. He did not need to shout to be memorable. Sometimes, the most powerful thing about BJ was how much he tried to hold inside. Through BJ, MASH showed a different wound of war. Not only what happened to the body, but what happened to the people waiting at home, and to the men who feared they might never return to them the same. After the series, Mike Farrell continued working in television, film, writing, producing, and public advocacy. But to many fans, he remains B.J. Hunnicutt, the gentle heart of the later years. And before B.J. became Hawkeye's closest friend, there was another man beside him, Trapper John. And when Wayne Rogers left MASH, the show was never quite the same again. Before B.J. Hunnicutt arrived, Hawkeye's closest partner in the early years of MASH was Trapper John McIntyre. Played by Wayne Rogers, Trapper was charming, clever, rebellious, and just as willing as Hawkeye to laugh in the face of military absurdity. Together, they gave the early seasons their wild, loose energy. They were surgeons under pressure, but they were also men trying to stay sane by mocking the madness around them. Trapper was not simply Hawkeye's sidekick. He had his own warmth, his own bite, and his own quiet compassion. Wayne Rogers brought an easy confidence to the role, making Trapper feel like the kind of friend you would want beside you when the world stopped making sense. But then, after the third season, Wayne Rogers left the series. For fans, it was a major shift. The chemistry changed, the rhythm changed, and MASH had to grow into something different. After leaving the show, Rogers continued acting, but he also built a successful life outside traditional Hollywood fame, including business and financial work. His path proved that life after a classic TV role did not always mean chasing the same spotlight. Wayne Rogers passed away in 2015, but Trapper John remains one of the faces that defined the beginning of MASH. And he was not the only early cast member whose departure became part of television history. Wayne Rogers was not the only early cast member whose exit changed the shape of MASH. Two other departures became part of the show's history: McLean Stevenson as Colonel Henry Blake and Larry Linville as Major Frank Burns. Henry Blake was never the perfect commander. He was disorganized, gentle, overwhelmed, and often looked like a man who had wandered into authority by accident. But that was what made him feel so human. McLean Stevenson gave Henry a warmth that made the 4077th feel less like a military unit and more like a strange, broken family. Then came one of the most shocking moments in television history. Henry was finally going home. And then he was gone. For viewers, His death was not just sad. It was a reminder that MASH was never going to let war become harmless entertainment. Even the funny, familiar faces were not safe. Larry Linville's Frank Burns was different. Frank was rigid, insecure, jealous, and often ridiculous. He was the kind of character audiences loved to dislike. But he also gave the early seasons a sharp comic tension that helped define the show's original rhythm. When both Stevenson and Linville left, MASH had to change. And somehow, it did. Their exits opened the door for new characters, deeper stories, and a more mature version of the series. But for longtime fans, Henry Blake and Frank Burns still remain part of the foundation. McLean Stevenson passed away in 1996. Larry Linville passed away in 2000. And decades later, their absences still remind us how much of MASH was built on people who left too soon, both on screen and in real life. But as some early faces disappeared, others arrived and helped the 4077th grow older, wiser, and even more unforgettable. As MASH changed, 3 men helped give the later seasons a deeper, quieter kind of strength. Harry Morgan arrived as Colonel Sherman Potter, and the 4077th immediately felt different. He was not Henry Blake, and he never tried to be. Potter brought age, discipline, warmth, and a sense of old-fashioned dignity. He could be firm without being cruel. He could lead without losing compassion. And in a camp full of fear and exhaustion, he became the kind of father figure many of them did not know they needed. Then came David Ogden Stiers as Charles Emerson Winchester. At first, Charles seemed arrogant, privileged, and impossible to like. But over time, MASH revealed the loneliness beneath his pride. He was brilliant, refined, often difficult, but also capable of surprising tenderness. He made the show smarter, sharper, and more emotionally complex. And quietly, through it all, there was William Christopher as Father Mulcahy. He was not a surgeon. He was not a soldier in the usual sense, but he carried the spiritual weight of the 4077th. He listened, he comforted, he questioned his own usefulness. And somehow, in a place filled with suffering, he kept trying to believe that goodness still mattered. Harry Morgan, David Ogden Stiers, and William Christopher have all passed away. But their characters remain essential to why MASH still feels so human. Potter gave the camp wisdom. Winchester gave it complexity. Father Mulcahy gave it conscience. By 2026, the list of faces we have lost from MASH is long. And that makes the few who are still with us feel even more precious. By 2026, asking who is still alive from MASH has become more than a simple question. It has become a way of measuring time. So many familiar faces from the 4077th are gone now. Henry Blake, Frank Burns, Colonel Potter, Father Mulcahy, Charles Winchester, Trapper John, Margaret Houlihan. Each name brings back a voice, a gesture, a scene, a laugh, or a goodbye that still lives in the memory of American television. But a few important voices remain. Alan Alda is still with us, the man who made Hawkeye Pierce funny, wounded, angry, and unforgettable. Gary Burghoff, who gave Radar O'Reilly his innocence, is still part of the living memory of the show. Jamie Farr, beloved as Maxwell Klinger, remains one of the last great comic survivors of the 4077th. And Mike Farrell, whose B.J. Hunnicutt brought gentleness and quiet pain to the later years, is still here as well. That is what makes the story so emotional. The question is no longer only, where are they now? It is how many voices from the 4077th are still here to answer. And after all these years, the answer reminds us that MASH is no longer just a show from the past. It is a reunion that keeps getting smaller. Which is why the final episode America watched together now feels even more powerful. Long before streaming finales became online events, MASH gave America a goodbye that felt almost impossible to repeat. The final episode was not just the end of a television series, it felt like the closing of a chapter in American life. For 11 seasons, viewers had lived with the 4077th. They had heard the helicopters, they had watched the doctors run into surgery, they had laughed at the jokes, felt the heartbreak, and slowly come to understand that every goodbye in this show carried the weight of war. Then came goodbye, farewell, and amen. It was not a simple farewell. It was emotional, painful, strange, and deeply human. Hawkeye was broken in a way audiences had never fully seen before. Friends who had survived so much together were finally being pulled apart. The war was ending, but not everyone could leave it behind untouched. That was the power of MASH. It knew that going home did not always mean being healed. For millions of Americans, the finale felt personal because the characters no longer felt like characters. They felt like people the audience had known for years. Hawkeye, BJ, Margaret, Klinger, Potter, Father Mulcahy, they were no longer just names in a cast. They were part of a shared memory. And now, decades later, that final goodbye feels even heavier. Because so many of the faces who stood inside that farewell are no longer with us. The episode ended a show, but time turned it into something more. A reminder that even the loudest laughter eventually becomes memory, and even the people who helped America through difficult years must one day become part of the past. And that is why saying goodbye to MASH still hurts. Because for many viewers, they were not saying goodbye to a sitcom. They were saying goodbye to old friends. In the end, MASH was never only about war. It was about the people who tried to stay human inside it. Hawkeye used humor because pain was always too close. Margaret fought for respect in a world that underestimated her. Radar carried innocence through a place that kept trying to take it away. Klinger turned desperation into comedy. BJ held on to the idea of home. Potter gave the camp wisdom. Winchester gave it complexity. Father Mulcahy gave it conscience. Together, they made the 4077th feel less like a fictional army hospital and more like a place America had actually visited. And more than 50 years later, that is why the cast still matters. Some of them are still with us. Alda, Gary Burghoff, Jamie Farr, and Mike Farrell remain living connections to a show that changed television forever. But so many others are gone now. Loretta Swit, Wayne Rogers, McLean Stevenson, Larry Linville, Harry Morgan, David Ogden Stiers, William Christopher, and many more who helped make MASH unforgettable. Their faces may belong to the past, but their voices still echo every time someone returns to the 4077th. Because MASH did something rare. It made people laugh at war without ever making war feel harmless. It turned pain into comedy, comedy into truth, and truth into television history. So when we ask who is still alive after all these years, we are really asking something deeper. Who remains from the family we grew up watching? And who do we still miss? Which MASH cast member do you remember most? And do you still remember watching that final goodbye?